June 4, 1944. The cold Atlantic waters churned beneath the vast sky, 150 miles west of Cape Blanco, Africa. On this fateful day, a scene unfolded in the midst of World War II that would change naval warfare and history forever. For 58 German sailors, this was the day they expected to die. The U-505, a formidable German submarine that had spent 2 years terrorizing Allied shipping, lay crippled in the open sea. Its crew, bloodied and exhausted from a brutal depth charge attack, watched in stunned silence as their once proud vessel struggled to stay afloat. With water flooding its hull and diesel engines sputtering, it seemed certain that the end had come. The warship, now barely a shadow of its former self, had been rendered a helpless target. For the men aboard, this was the end of a long and savage journey. They had lived through the terrifying uncertainty of the high seas, facing not just the peril of warfare, but the weight of personal tragedies, lives lost, missions failed, and the ever-present fear of dying far from home. Now they were floating in enemy waters, surrounded by the sight of American warships closing in, knowing that death or captivity awaited them. As the American destroyers circled the stricken submarine, the German sailors feared the worst. Their worst nightmares were not far off. They had heard the stories, the brutal interrogations, the swift executions, the merciless treatment that came with being captured by the enemy. With every passing second, the hopelessness of their situation deepened. Their once proud U-boat, U-505, was about to become a tragic monument to the destruction and futility of war. But then, something unexpected happened. Captain Daniel Gallery, the unassuming but fiercely determined commander of the USS Guadalcanal, saw the U-505 from the bridge of his ship. The American task group had been hunting German submarines for months, but what Gallery saw in that moment defied every naval convention he had been taught. In an era was given, where sinking the enemy was the ultimate goal, Gallery saw an opportunity to do something radically different. Instead of finishing the U-505 off with gunfire and leaving the enemy to drown, Gallery did something that would defy military logic and set the stage for a decision that would echo through history. Without hesitation, Captain Gallery issued the order that would forever change the fate of those 58 German sailors. Away all boats. We're going to board her. The signal was clear. An American boarding party would attempt to capture the enemy submarine intact. The moment was surreal. The men aboard the U-505, still reeling from the shock of the attack and the realization that their fate was sealed, now faced an unexpected turn of events. Their lives, which had been hanging by a thread, were suddenly in the hands of their American captors. Would they be met with brutal interrogation, or would they be treated with something much more unexpected? As Gallery's men launched boats and made their way toward the submarine, the air was thick with tension. Some German sailors began to abandon ship, fleeing into the cold Atlantic waters, desperate to escape the flames and smoke pouring from the U-505's hull. Others, wounded and disoriented, clung to their vessel as they awaited the unknown fate that awaited them. What happened next, in the span of mere minutes, would set the stage for a battle not just of guns and ships, but of honor and humanity, a battle that would challenge everything both sides knew about war, and force the world to reckon with a truth that transcended nations and uniforms. The German sailors, expecting death, were about to encounter something that would change them forever. It wasn't a bullet, a bomb, or a depth charge. It was something far rarer, American decency in the midst of total war. June 4th, 1944, was a day that would resonate in history not only for the boldness of the U-505's capture, but also for the man who made it happen, Captain Daniel Gallery. A man of calculated risks and unyielding conviction, Gallery's actions would forever alter the course of naval history and redefine what it meant to be a leader in the chaos of war. Born in the working-class neighborhoods of Chicago, Daniel Gallery was an Irish-American who had risen through the ranks of the U.S. Navy. His upbringing instilled in him a strong sense of honor and a belief that a man's word was his bond. In his world, rules were meant to be followed, but only if they aligned with what was right. There was a moral code that he held dear, one that guided his decisions in both times of peace and, more importantly, in war. By 1943, Captain Gallery found himself commanding Task Group 22-3, a formidable force tasked with hunting German submarines in the treacherous waters of the Atlantic. The group, including his flagship USS Guadalcanal and 5 destroyer escorts, was made up of men who knew their job well: sink U-boats and protect Allied shipping. But for Gallery, sinking U-boats wasn't enough. He wanted more. In the face of overwhelming odds, he believed in the impossible. His eyes were set on capturing an enemy submarine, an idea so audacious that even his own superiors thought him mad. Since the War of 1812, no U.S. Navy vessel had captured an enemy warship on the high seas. Submarines, after all, were designed to sink quickly once damaged, and their crews were trained to scuttle them before they could fall into enemy hands. Yet Captain Gallery was not deterred. He believed that there was honor to be found in the very act of capturing a submarine, honor for the Navy, for his crew, and for his country. With a single-minded focus, Gallery set about preparing his crew for this impossible mission. The men aboard the Guadalcanal drilled tirelessly for what seemed an absurd mission. Gallery. When the moment came, they would be ready, not just to sink a U-boat, but to bring one back intact. His obsession with this goal became a defining feature of his leadership, and though some of his men thought him eccentric, others found a deep sense of purpose in his vision. To them, Gallery wasn't just a captain, he was a symbol of unshakable resolve. Gallery's daring idea, however, was not born in a vacuum. The backdrop of submarine warfare during World War II was brutal and unforgiving. By 1944, German U-boats had sunk over 3,000 Allied ships, leaving countless families devastated as they lost loved ones in the icy waters of the Atlantic. The U-505, specifically, had been terrorizing Allied shipping routes for 2 years, leaving a trail of personal and military tragedies in its wake. But for all the destruction U-boats had wrought, the time had come to turn the tide. The problem with the conventional approach to submarine warfare was simple. Both sides had abandoned the gentlemanly traditions that had once defined naval combat. The Germans, under the brutal command of Adolf Hitler, had adopted a sink-on-sight policy, attacking without mercy. For the Allies, especially the United States, the urgency to eradicate the threat posed by the U-boats was palpable. It was not just about winning the war, it was about survival. Despite the rising tide of violence and loss, Captain Gallery believed there was another way. He wasn't interested in simply defeating the Germans in the traditional sense. He wanted to show the world that, even in the darkest hours of war, there could still be moments of honor and humanity. This belief would set him on a course that defied the brutal norms of naval warfare. By the time U-505 surfaced on June 4, 1944, Gallery had already prepared his men for what seemed like the impossible. As the Guadalcanal closed in on the crippled German submarine, Captain Gallery knew that this was the moment he had been waiting for, the decision he next would defy all expectations. With the U-505's fate hanging in the balance, Captain Gallery could have followed standard procedure and ordered the destruction of the enemy submarine. The war was about winning, and sinking the U-505 was a guaranteed victory. But for Gallery, this was not about victory alone, it was about a greater legacy. As he stood on the bridge of the Guadalcanal, Captain Gallery made a decision that would shock his crew, his superiors, and the world. Instead of giving the order to sink U-505, he told his men to prepare to board her. Gallery knew that this could be his only chance to capture an intact U-boat. He would not let this moment slip away. This was the kind of bold, unconventional thinking that would define his legacy. And so, against all odds, Captain Gallery made history that day, not through sheer military might, but through a profound sense of humanity, choosing honor over destruction, and giving the enemy something they never expected, mercy. 09 a.m. on June 4, 1944, and the Atlantic was about to bear witness to an extraordinary act of fate. The U-505, crippled and vulnerable, had broken the surface of the ocean like a wounded beast gasping for air. For the crew of the USS Guadalcanal, their moment had finally come. Their mission, their years of preparation, and their captain's audacious plan were about to be put to the test. But what they did not know was that, in those final moments of desperation, a German sailor's panicked decision would change everything. Lieutenant William T. Tolan, piloting a Grumman TBF Avenger, had been conducting a routine patrol, scanning the sea for any signs of enemy activity. He had been flying in a tight pattern, his eyes scanning the horizon, when a dark shape suddenly appeared beneath the surface. Tolan's heart skipped a beat. It was unmistakable, a U-boat, a German submarine. But there was something strange about it. The U-505, once a feared predator of the Atlantic, now seemed to be struggling, drifting aimlessly, its once proud hull barely staying afloat. In an instant, Tolan made his decision. He radioed back to the Guadalcanal, reporting the sighting of the U-505. There was no time to waste. The submarine, despite being an enemy vessel, was a sitting duck, its engines sputtering, its crew desperately trying to stabilize the ship. But the Americans knew better than to let this moment slip away. This was a rare opportunity, one that could change the entire course of the war. The next few minutes unfolded in a blur of calculated chaos. Tolan released his depth charges, a sharp burst of violence aimed directly at the U-505. The explosion reverberated through the waters, sending shockwaves through the submarine's fragile hull. Tolan could see the damage as the submarine struggled to stay afloat. The depth charges had torn into the U-505's diving planes and electrical systems, leaving the crew with a crucial decision. The U-boat was now in a race against time. The clock, and the fate of the 58 German sailors aboard hung in the balance. Captain Harold Lang, the 40-year-old German commander of U-505, had never been under more pressure. His crew, already demoralized from months of failed attacks and dwindling supplies, had been pushed to the brink. The men aboard U-505 had already seen their previous captain's tragic breakdown, an incident that had shattered the crew's morale. Now, in the face of near-certain destruction, Lang had to make a fateful choice: continue the fight and risk the submarine sinking, or take a chance and try to save the crew by surfacing. Lang's mind raced. He knew that if he didn't act quickly, they would all be lost. The American depth charge had taken out vital systems, and the U-505 was sinking rapidly. His only hope was to surface the submarine, despite the danger it posed. The decision was made in an instant: surface immediately. Lang barked to his crew, his voice laced with the weight of a captain's duty. The order was desperate, but necessary. As the crew scrambled to execute the command, the submarine groaned under the stress. At 11:15 a.m., U-505 broke the surface of the Atlantic like a wounded whale. The crew scrambled for air, their faces pale from smoke and fear. The sight was horrifying. Water gushed from the hull, and thick black smoke billowed from the submarine's engines. The U-505, once a symbol of German naval power, was now a ghost ship, struggling to stay afloat in enemy waters. For Captain Daniel Gallery, this was the moment he had been waiting for. From the bridge of the Guadalcanal, he could see the U-505 struggling to stay afloat. The decision was clear. The time to act was now. Gallery knew the U-505 was on the brink of collapse. He had mere seconds to make a choice that would echo in the annals of history. In an instant, Gallery issued the order: away all boats. We're going to board her. His men, who had spent countless hours drilling for this impossible mission, sprang into. The boats were launched, and the crew made their way toward the U-505, their hearts pounding in anticipation. But what Gallery's men didn't know was that they were racing against time. The Germans aboard U-505, already battered by the depth charge attack, had one last desperate chance to destroy their vessel. Petty Officer Gottfried Fischer, in a panicked attempt to prevent the Americans from boarding, had been tasked with setting the scuttling charges that would send the U-505 to the bottom of the Atlantic. But in his rush, Fischer made a fatal error. Instead of setting the timer for the usual 30 seconds, Fischer set it for a full 7 minutes. This small mistake, this critical miscalculation, would save the lives of everyone on board, both German and American. As the German sailors scrambled to escape the doomed submarine, the Americans were unaware that they had just been given a chance: 7 minutes to board and secure the U-500. and 5 before it would be lost to the ocean forever. The Guadalcanal's boats hit the water. The sense of urgency was palpable. Every second counted. Lieutenant Albert David, 23 years old and already accustomed to the perils of war, was preparing for what could only be described as a suicide mission. Leading the boarding party, David knew what he was getting into. The U-505 was sinking, her crew was abandoning ship, and every second they delayed could mean a fiery, watery death. Yet, despite the overwhelming risks, there was no hesitation in his movements. The crew of the Guadalcanal had trained for this. They had drilled on how to board a sinking submarine, how to subdue enemy sailors, and how to neutralize any threats within the vessel. But nothing could have prepared them for the reality of what awaited them aboard the U-505. Thick black smoke, water flooding through her hull, and the unmistakable sound of ticking, scuttling charges counting down the minutes before detonation. In those early moments, David's thoughts were consumed not by fear, but by the grim determination to do his duty, knowing that failure would mean the loss of not just the submarine, but also his men's lives. As David and his men rowed toward the U-505, they could see the chaos unfolding on board. German sailors, disoriented and terrified, were abandoning ship in droves. Some were wounded, others looked lost, but all shared the same belief: they were about to die. With the submarine on the verge of exploding, the American boarding party approached, their eyes scanning for any sign of life, or worse, booby traps. The situation was dire, yet there was something about it that seemed almost surreal. Here they were, about to board a damaged enemy warship, knowing full well that their mission was one wrong move away from disaster. When David's small boat finally reached the U-505, the crew was met with the staggering sight of the submarine's conning tower, the once imposing structure now listing and badly damaged. The smell of burning fuel and sound of electrical fires filled the air. As the American sailors boarded, they could hear the ominous ticking of the scuttling charges beneath their feet, each second a reminder of how fragile their survival was. David could feel the weight of the moment in his bones, the tension, the noise, the choking smoke, and yet, amid the chaos, he didn't hesitate. In a world where most captains would have taken the immediate course of action to retreat, David's instinct told him to advance. The mission was too important. If they retreated now, the U-505 would be lost, and the Germans would destroy all evidence that could potentially change the course of the war. David led his men through the smoke-filled corridors, his flashlight barely cutting through the darkness, the threat of an imminent explosion hanging over them like a sword. "Get below decks," he ordered. "We need to find the scuttling charges and disarm them before it's too late." The situation was like something out of a nightmare. Smoke billowed from the sub's gutted interior, and the smell of burning fuel mixed with the salty sea air. As David and his men made their way deeper into the submarine, they found themselves fighting not only against the elements, but also against time. The ticking of the scuttling charge was like the beat of a drum, each tick an agonizing reminder of their limited window to save the ship. Finally, David and his team located the scuttling charges in the control room. Working quickly and with extreme caution, they began the delicate task of disarming the timers. David, though young, was steady under pressure. With no prior knowledge of German demolition devices, he and his team had to rely on their instincts and training. One wrong move, and they would all be dead. The tension in the room was unbearable as David carefully disabled the timer mechanism, holding his breath with every wire he cut, praying that the submarine wouldn't explode in their faces. When the last scuttling activated, a collective sigh of relief echoed through the control room. U-505 was no longer sinking. The damage was still severe, but the submarine was stable, for now. As the crew moved to secure the rest of the U-505, David took a moment to process what had just transpired. The submarine, which had been seconds away from being lost to the ocean, had been saved by the courage and quick thinking of a young American officer and his crew. They had faced death, and they had triumphed, but the real test had only just begun. The once feared U-505, now secured and stabilized, lay eerily silent on the Atlantic waters. The black smoke had cleared, the chaos had subsided, but what Captain Daniel Gallery and his crew faced next was a problem of an entirely different nature. It wasn't just about maintaining control of the captured U-boat. It was about what to do with the 58 German sailors who had just been pulled from the cold, hostile sea, expecting to die. In the tense moments following the capture, Gallery was confronted with a decision that could alter the future of warfare itself. The usual procedure was clear: interrogate the prisoners, then transport them to POW camps. But that would mean compromising the incredible intelligence that had just been secured. The code books, charts, and the precious Enigma machine were still on board, untouched. A treasure trove of secrets that could turn the tide of the war. And Gallery knew that the only way to preserve that intelligence was to keep it hidden, to keep the Germans unaware of the full scale of what had been captured. But the question remained: how would he treat the prisoners? What would he do with the men who had once been his enemies, now stranded in the middle of the Atlantic, staring at their impending capture? What Gallery decided in that moment would set a precedent not only for wartime conduct, but also for the nature of humanity during one of history's darkest chapters. The German sailors, still shaken from the attack, had no idea what awaited them. They had been taught that American soldiers were monsters, brutal and unforgiving. They had been told that if captured, they would face horrific interrogations, punishment, and death. The reality was something entirely different. As the American boats approached to rescue the German survivors, something utterly unprecedented happened. Instead of rough handling or immediate interrogation, they were pulled aboard the American vessels and treated with unexpected dignity. The sailors were given medical attention, fresh clothing, and, perhaps most shockingly, hot food. In the midst of a brutal war, when cruelty and dehumanization were the norm, Captain Gallery chose to break the cycle of hatred. He treated the German sailors not as prisoners to be interrogated or executed, but as fellow sailors. Men who had fought bravely for their country, but who, in this moment, had become victims of a much larger machine of war. Gallery's decision was more than just an act of mercy. It was a calculated move, one that would have profound implications for the intelligence operation that was now in motion. By treating the German sailors with respect, Gallery ensured that they would be more likely to cooperate and, crucially, maintain the secrecy of the intelligence they had just uncovered. The German officers, including Captain Harold Lang, who had been expecting a brutal interrogation, were instead met with what Lang would later describe as unexpected American courtesy. When Lang and his officers were brought aboard the USS Guadalcanal, they expected to be held in harsh conditions, their fate sealed. Instead, they were met with warmth, with respect, and with an offer of dialogue. Gallery, in his pragmatic brilliance, explained the situation to the Germans with clarity and honor. Their submarine had been captured, legitimately, by the rules of naval warfare. They were prisoners now, but they would be treated with military respect. This wasn't just about kindness, it was about securing the intelligence that would shape the outcome of the war. By ensuring the Germans were treated well, Gallery also ensured their cooperation in preserving the Enigma codes and technical documents they had left behind. The act of mercy, however, had a profound psychological effect on the German crew. For Lang and his men, who had been raised to see Americans as ruthless and brutal, the treatment they received was both a revelation and a personal transformation. They had expected to die, to be, by the machines of war, but instead they were given life, a second chance, one that they never expected. In the days that followed, Gallery's decision would continue to reverberate throughout the Guadalcanal and beyond. The sailors aboard the ship, many of whom had fought the Germans in the brutal battles of the Atlantic, were forced to confront their own perceptions of the enemy. The men who had once been their mortal adversaries were now the very same men they had saved. And in that moment of shared humanity, the soldiers of both nations found something profound. The realization that even in the middle of war there were choices to be made, choices that reflected honor, dignity, and respect for life. For the Germans aboard the USS Guadalcanal, the treatment they received was a revelation. They had been conditioned to see the Americans as enemies to be feared and despised. But now, they saw something different. They saw soldiers, American sailors, who had chosen to honor their captured foes. This moment would stay with them for the rest of their lives, transforming their view of the enemy of war and of humanity itself. But what Captain Gallery didn't know was that this decision, this seemingly small act of mercy in the middle of the ocean, would come to symbolize more than just a strategic maneuver. It would become a model for how to treat prisoners of war, one that would be studied and emulated for decades to come. The lesson of U-505 wasn't just about capturing a submarine or gathering intelligence. It was about showing that, even in the most brutal moments of history, humanity could still prevail. As the German sailors were taken to Camp Rustin, Louisiana, to begin their captivity, they were once again faced with something entirely unexpected. The conditions there were unlike anything they had imagined. Instead of harsh prison camps, the Germans found themselves housed in clean barracks, given regular meals, and even allowed to engage in recreational activities. They were treated like professional soldiers, not criminals. They worked for wages, maintained discipline, and were given a level of dignity that was nearly unheard of for prisoners of war during this time. And this wasn't just about kindness, it was a strategy. By treating the German crew with respect, Gallery ensured their cooperation. It was a psychological strategy, one that paid off in ways even Gallery couldn't have anticipated. The Germans, who had once believed they were enemies of the American people, now found themselves in a position to cooperate, to share their knowledge willingly, and to contribute to the Allied war effort.